that he kept going on the last days and weeks of the war. He was in the shelter, and he just let his men die.
Oh, sure. He thought, the historical record's quite clear. Hitler felt that he had been let down by the German people, and it was fine that everything burned. Yeah. And, you might say, if you were skeptical enough, that the burning was the point. You see, and I believe that. And I mean, things are multi-leveled, right? But the question is, well, what was animating Hitler, let's say? Well, you might say, well, it was Hitler himself. It's like, no, there was a dread spirit animating Hitler. And what was it after? Well, it was after Hitler's suicide in a bunker in 1945 with Europe in flames. That's what it was after. And that's what it got.
That was the aim, actually.
That was the aim. Yeah. You bet. That was the intent. Hitler was a singular personality, very creative, very assertive, and also very good at pattern recognition. It was part of his creativity. Okay, so now here's the... Oh, yes, he was a very creative person.
No, I knew that, but pattern.
Oh, yes. Well, it's part of being creative, is to recognize patterns, to pick them up unconsciously. Because that's what an artist does, is pick up patterns unconsciously and then portray them, right? And in an attempt to make them conscious. That's part of the artistic process. Okay, so now he's brutalized, right? He went through trench warfare in World War I, and he's thwarted because he wanted to become an artist, and he applied to become an artist. I think it was in Vienna. Yeah, I think it was 3 times, and he was rejected all 3 times. Homeless. Many of his friends had been killed in World War I. It was brutal, and there's no evidence that he was a coward in World War I. He got a medal for valor, And if I remember correctly, there was one time in his life where he was in a trench warfare scene with his friends, and he wandered off away from them. And when he came back, a mortar had landed in the middle of the group and killed everyone. Now, that does something to you psychologically as well, right? Because it makes you feel special, marked out, because you didn't die, but everyone else did, right? So anyways, so there's Hitler, and then he's surrounded by brutalized men, and Germany is completely demolished, and the economy is in shambles, and the communists are threatening, and it's like, and then of course there's hyperinflation, and the Germans all feel betrayed, and it's like it's a mess the magnitude of which we can barely even imagine. And so then he starts talking to people because he's not very happy. And he's willing to go where the crowd leads him. That's the thing. Now, the funny thing is that a good leader has a dialogue with the crowd. But a good leader isn't willing to go wherever the crowd wants to go. Okay. It's a dialogue, but not Hitler. It's not a dialogue precisely. Or if it is, it's a dialogue with a darker side of him. So this is what happens. So he stands in front of the crowd, and he has some oratorical ability, so he can captivate people. And because maybe he is one of those vessels through which the crowd can speak. So he says these sentences, nothing happens. Then he says these sentences, and he gets a bit of a rise out of the crowd. And then he says the same sentences, but he puts a flourish on them, and then it gets a real rise out of the crowd. And the little pattern recognition module in his mind thinks, okay, not so much of that, and quite a bit more of this. And so then he does that again, and he gets a little better at it. And so there's quite a bit more of the crowd-pleasing rhetoric, and the crowds get more enthusiastic. And he's watching and attending and shifting his behavior.
Is that a pattern? Like he's making the pattern of the
pattern is the pattern of the crowd's desire is manifesting itself in his imagination, and he's giving voice to it. The question is, well, what does the angry post-war German crowd want? So you could think of Hitler as the articulated embodiment of the maddened crowd, right? And then there's a dynamic, right? So the crowd broadcasts its resentment to the leader, and the leader says, oh, this is what you mean. And the crowd goes, yes, that's what we mean. And then they get more fired up, and the leader listens and recognizes the pattern and says, so this is what you want. And the crowd goes, yes. And it's a feedback loop, right? And he was very good at that. He was willing to use the gift of his voice in the service of the darkest desire of the maddened crowd. Well, it's like calling Satan himself up from the depths. It's a good enough metaphor, man. unless someone can come up with a better one, like that.